12 of Conversations for the End. Today's guest is Dr. Robert Tyminski. Robert is an adult and child analyst, member of the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco, and a past president of the Institute. He teaches and lectures across the US and internationally, and he is the author of a number of works, including The Psychological Effects of Immigrating, a depth psychology perspective on relocating to a new place, Male Alienation at the Crossroads of Identity, Culture and Cyberspace, Crooked Lines, and The Psychology of Theft and Loss, Stolen and Fleeced. He is a 2016 and 2025 winner of the Michael Fordham Prize from the Journal of Analytical Psychology, and he is working on a new book about psychotherapy and analysis with boys and young men. This was one I was greatly looking forward to. I read Robert's book some time back, and I was extremely engaged in it and learnt a lot from it, and got to revisit it again for the prep for this podcast. And again, sort of more insights were provided. I think, the conversation around sort of young men and men in general is something that is often talked about with the sort of ever-increasing attention on things like the manosphere, figures like Andrew Tate, and recently the release of Netflix's Adolescence, and the conversations that kind of sparked. So, Robert's work is, more important than ever, really. And he's full of lots and lots of interesting ideas and ways of thinking about, the problems that many young men are facing today, whether it comes to the internet or identity or, various different aspects. So, look, I hope you enjoy the show. Please do, if you are listening on YouTube, please just head over to Instagram and give us a follow, because we put out other content on there. If you're listening on YouTube or on Spotify, please subscribe on something. That would be good. I hope you enjoy it. And here we go. Dr. Robert Tyminski. Dr. Tyminski, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to chatting with you.
So, I want to get straight into it, ultimately. Tell me about what you see as the apocalypse affecting males of today.
So apocalypse is a complicated word for multiple reasons. It has a dual meaning, and I think the more common usage that we're familiar with, or at least that I was familiar with, was like a doomsday scenario. And there's a lot of popularity in video games that boys and young men play of these kind of end of world type settings. And it's not only there, it's also in film and in anime. Other things that in media that they're interested in, you see this kind of fascination with when everything really falls apart and chaos is knocking at the door. The other meaning of apocalypse is from the Bible and the original Greek, and it means revelation or uncovering. And I think that's sort of an interesting shadow aspect of the word, that there is something about anyone's fascination with destructive content that usually is covering up something else. And so the question would be, what's underneath? What is it covering up? And what is it that could be uncovered? So I think those would be, just some ways that the word has occurred to me. In my work, the other two ways that I would mention are through dreams. So patients, young men, boys, teenage boys reporting dreams where they're often facing the end of the world. These are really nightmares if we think about them. And often they're in a heroic position. They're trying to do something to rescue people, to save them. And so that's definitely a positive in the dream. But if you think about the dream as somehow a message from the unconscious about how the person feels about what's around them, then certainly that apocalyptic theme would be concerning. It's about something getting out of hand and becoming chaotic. The other way that it has shown up is in behavioral issues. So with young men who are teenage boys who are engaging in self-harming, and that could be cutting, it could be really I'm trying to think of the right word here, but unwise substance abuse, as if there is a wise way to use substance. So that's why it's a little funny for me to use that word. But there is a way to experiment, right? When you're a teenager or a young adult, that if you're using moderation, you're around some people who you trust and it's a safe setting. That's a little bit different. But I'm talking about, people who might go on, Hate Street is here, one of the streets, although it's not the only one in San Francisco where you can get drugs easily. And they might buy mushrooms and not know about the dosing and things like that. And so they could end up in really in a psychotic state. I've had that happen before. So it's those behavioral things that feel chaotic that, again, have a sense of something being transmitted. It's of course through behavior and through the young man's body, but it's about this apocalyptic kind of sensation.
And one of the things you mention in the book, which future me would have talked about a little bit more in the intro to this podcast, you talk about the lack of presence of older men, sort of father figures, and people who are kind of victims of a certain type of masculinity, people who are culturally sort of separate, trapped in addiction, like you're mentioning. They fall behind socially, economically. They can be kind of fall prey to this kind of destructive element of this kind of this sort of apocalypse. And it seems that that's quite a common, especially I guess with the Jungian perspective. There's a lot of talk often in any book on masculinity about how modern culture kind of lacks initiation and these kind of elder masculine figures. So bringing this into, parts of this book in regards to male alienation and cyberspace, where do you think the internet, how do you think the sort of rise of the internet, the kind of changing dynamics of the internet and the rapid sort of development of it has started to affect men who are perhaps vulnerable to this kind of apocalypse?
Yeah, we might have to bookmark fathers, because that would be interesting to talk about too, because I think that's really a part of, like, who are the male figures that a boy, a young man, has to look to. It's not just look up to, but it's to feel some sense of connection with, someone that you can horse around with, joke with. And someone you feel like gets you in some sense, gets your maleness, gets what kind of a boy you are and what kind of a boy you're turning out to be, those sorts of things. The internet, so I'm going to segue into the main point of your question about the internet. has really dramatically changed things. And I always have to do, it's like the little disclaimer on uh, any sort of supplement that you buy, that this thing has not been, approved by the authorities of who study the effectiveness. And so it's my little caveat or disclaimer that I don't mean to be alarmist. But I think the internet is in some ways like a mass corporate experiment that has been conducted primarily on young people. And these companies have, brought out so many different products that are fascinating. They're fun. They allow people to connect and explore in ways that weren't possible before. Social media is really since the early 2000s and more so since around 2005, 2006 with the launch of smartphones. And so that's where this other window really opened up. And I think a lot of boys really saw it as a way then to connect with one another, to play these video games that they really love playing. They're not all about the apocalyptic stuff. I mean, I think the most popular two now might be Minecraft and Roblox, which are about building. But there are destructive modes. There's like zombie mode and kill mode and that sort of thing, even on Minecraft and Roblox. Um, so it opened up a lot of possibilities. But the internet, if you think about the promise in the 1990s, is that it was going to democratize knowledge, that it was going to promote a kind of egalitarian access for people to communicate unimpeded, and that it would really usher in this information age where people would kind of become better informed. Well, I don't know that we can give it failing grades on those three things, but probably, what in the US we would say is a D. So that's a pretty low grade. And instead, what has happened is that the internet is about profit, and it's about clicks, it's about attention. It's become a demand economy that focuses on a person's attention. And so you think about, boys using it now, and like I said, a lot of them, I think it's for video gaming, and a lot of it is YouTube. Instagram and Snap kind of have taken over here in the US a little bit, since TikTok has been under this one day it's banned, one day it's not kind of thing. But they'll use Instagram mostly to connect with friends and post short things, funny videos that they're taking. But the sense of on YouTube is often to watch things, and there's a little bit, because YouTube uses this algorithm that is based on intensifying what you're watching. So I've used this example before. If you're interested, say, in American history, you might watch a history professor giving a not very interesting or a very interesting lecture at some university. And then the algorithm will recommend, well, if you're interested in US history, maybe you might be interested in US politics. And so then I'm simplifying a bit, but then they'll click on that, and then then it's from politics to, well, maybe you might be interested in something real right wing or real left wing. So it intensifies the viewing, and there isn't, I often think there isn't, part of the problem with the internet is there isn't someone around to tell you you've had enough, or stop, or take a break, right? It'd be great if there was a little hand that reached out from the screens and sort of, poked at us and said, okay, that's enough right now. So that sense of limiting oneself, I think, on the internet is problematic, especially for adolescents and for adolescent boys. You can see they go down these rabbit holes. I've had several in my practice who, have really kind of immersed themselves in what's called the manosphere. And it's not just that they're listening to Joe Rogan or someone, but then they also start watching these very far right conspiracy podcasts, or I guess they're really videos on YouTube about really awful things, where there's a lot of misogyny, racism, homophobia that's openly expressed, and with the attitude of it's free speech.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess what you touched on earlier with the kind of addictive nature of this and how that's kind of led by, the companies behind the technology. It's that idea of limbic capitalism, how the sites are designed to grab your attention and to draw you in. And yet, because of this kind of algorithmic, kind of slow, not even slow, I think Laura Bates in her book did a test with this, and I think from one video, sort of generally speaking about feminism, it took 6 videos to get to something extremely misogynistic, extremely deep in that manosphere kind of culture, if she just let it run. So that kind of quick movement into more extreme content, it's almost like a form of and I'm being sort of loose with this idea, but a digital psychosis, because you're addicted to it. It's marketed to be addictive, through the companies, and it changes your perception of the world as you consume it over time, right? The more of those sort of extreme conspiracy videos you watch, that's going to change when you move away from the screen. And I think you have a really nice way of putting it in the book, and I absolutely love the quote. You say, "Without a secure boundary between inside and outside, ego capacities can suffer." And you talk about how it will affect people's ability to understand the limits of their desires, flexible thinking about their choices, delay of impulses, verbal expression, and affect regulation. Is there anything you can expand a bit more on that, and how that kind of, turns into a more transactional relationship with the external world, once you've sort of been in the digital cyberspace world?
Chris, it's always music to an author's ear when somebody quotes something they wrote, so thank you.
You're welcome.
There are 2 components, I guess, that I would pick up on. So the way these things are marketed, the apps, the programs, the video games, even YouTube with this algorithm, these algorithms use something called intermittent reinforcement. And I know you know quite a bit about psychology. So the thing about intermittent reinforcement is it's what's used in a casino, that you don't know when you're going to get rewarded or how much. And that those two, the brain doesn't like uncertainty. And so the brain very easily can be seduced into a loop of trying to predict that it's about to happen. The thing has not happened in a long time. And because of that, the brain can also get seduced into thinking, because it hasn't happened in a long time, it's going to be bigger than it should have been. And so it's that loop of intermittent reinforcement that they use. And, you see this. I don't know if you've played any, I imagine you might have played, I don't want to speak for you, any of these video games, but they often will have rewards. And the idea is to collect the rewards. Often when you're playing, you have something like a vault or a chest, and you can store your rewards in the vault or the chest. But again, these rewards often come in unexpected ways. So it's not just a matter of leveling up, which is what they talk about, but sometimes they'll be like just something appears, and if you happen to be at the right place at the right time, you get it. So that intermittent reinforcement, I think is a problem in terms of anything that's going to lead to something addictive, and that, you know, something starts out as play, it becomes a habit. It moves from being a habit to something that you kind of thoughtlessly do more often than you think you would do. Then from there, it edges into something that you do compulsively, because if you don't do it, you start to have feelings of anxiety or depression, sadness, loneliness. And then from there, it slips into addiction. So this is really a gradient we're talking about. That something starts out playful. It starts out well-intentioned and fun, and before you know it, it kind of migrates down that path. One of the issues that I think has been looked at quite a bit is what it does to a person's cognition. And it tends to break things down into more rigid thinking and something called magical thinking. Magical thinking, of course, is a term that's been around for, I think, almost 100 years. Both Piaget and Freud wrote about magical thinking. Jung didn't directly write about it, but he wrote about something similar called participation mystique, which is this sense of merging with an object or with an experience or with the world. And that's part of human nature. We all have those moments where we feel something awesome, and Jung would have called it numinous, and we feel drawn in by it. Think about, though, if you're doing that too much, that the psyche, the mind can't really cope with those experiences if you do it too much. And so magical thinking our computers really reinforce it. You know, even what we're doing is great, right? But we're communicating at a distance, so there's this sense of affecting something over space. That's not too far removed from telekinesis. There's the sense of you push a button if you want something, and nowadays the package can often be delivered that same day. So that's, again, affecting something at a distance to get something, and that's kind of like magic. And so are these different ways that it mimics something that I think we're all kind of in a I don't want to say primitive, but at a very basic level, primed for. We love magic. I think if a person doesn't love magic in some way, or didn't have an experience of loving magic, they really missed out on something. It's such a big part of growing up, and you know it continues into adulthood. So I think this magical thinking, though, if it becomes a sort of a way, it can be very omnipotent. The fantasy will be that you can control things, that you can get things you want, and that you're all powerful. And there's a way in which spending too much time on a screen, I think, really feeds into that.
Yeah, and I think your take on that specific omnipotence of it, the internet's ability to kind of see all, know all, sort of as this kind of disembodied entity that is now like an extension of ourselves, changes, obviously, gives us an omnipotent way of relating to ourselves and maybe to others. And I think that's a good segue. I'm going to go back to what we talked about with fathers. Okay, so I want to just touch briefly. Obviously, this is about alienation and adolescence and young men and the internet, and we've touched on the manosphere. Obviously, in the UK, they released the Netflix show Adolescence. I'm sure people have been asking you about this since it came out. What are your thoughts generally on that generally speaking? And maybe is there things that you think it got correct, things that it didn't quite get right about the situation for sort of young men in the internet?
Um, how much time do we have?
As long as you want to
It,
talk on this, because I appreciate. I want to go more, a little bit more into this idea of fathers, and perhaps we can
yeah,
kind of interlink these
sure.
ideas.
Yeah, the father in that show is so important. Jamie's father, the character Jamie. It gets a lot right, and I think it's an impressive show. It's hard to watch, and it should be hard to watch. It's disturbing. I think a lot of the questions that I've gotten uh, have surprised me a bit because have tended to go in two directions. One is that was it believable that he did it? And I've thought a lot about why people they want to believe that because he looks kind of at the beginning like he could be a little cherub or something, right? He's this blue-eyed, sweet, almost frail-looking boy, and so there's a certain projection that I think his appearance attracts of innocence. And so I've tried to understand why people find it so hard to believe that he could have done something so horrible, so awful. And I don't really know why there is this, but I think there's something about adults idealizing childhood and adolescence still in the internet age. And I think it's a defense in a way about adults not understanding something fundamental about how this medium is affecting their children, and their young adult children even. And so there's a kind of defensiveness that the idealization I think speaks to of like, well how could he really have done that? That it's something about letting them off the hook, letting the person, the adult, the parent, asking this kind of question off the hook a little bit about not really understanding the way the medium is affecting children. And so that's one kind of question I've gotten, and I think he does the actor who plays Jamie does such an amazing job because he depicts a psychopath. And so this is a second question that I've been asked is, have you ever encountered children like this? And sadly, I have. And I think some of it is unique to my experience. I used to run a school here in San Francisco for children who were what were called at the time severely emotionally disturbed. And these were children who could not attend what we call a regular public school because their behaviors were so extreme, violent often. So in the course of working at this school, I don't want to. Most of those kids turned out fine, and a lot of them had really good families. A lot of them had really traumatizing families as well. But there were a handful that I encountered who you just could feel like there was something in their wiring that almost felt inhuman. It's hard for me to say this because, of course, they weren't, and I'm at a little bit of using that word in a kind of stretching to understand it, but a sort of inhuman quality. And two of these boys that I worked with actually ended up in prison for murder later on. Now, not during the time they were at this school. They graduated from this school. The school only kept kids until they were 12 or 13. So we don't know we wouldn't know about their adolescence. in full. But what would happen in these two cases is that what we call public defenders contacted me as the administrator of the school when their clients, who they were representing in court, so the public defenders are the appointed attorneys in the U.S. for someone who has no means, and defends them in court when they're being prosecuted. And in these two cases for murder, and one was actually facing the death penalty. And that case was in a different state, not in California. The other one was in California. And so there are, it's like, it kind of breaks my heart to have to say to people, well, yeah, there are kids. It's rare. It is rare. That could turn out like this, and who are at risk for committing awful crimes. So the other question, and then I'll pause and let you kind of react here, so I don't go on too long. But the other question I've gotten is about the third episode, which is the one with the psychologist, and that is also, just a kind of general question. What do you think? Or didn't she do a good job? And I imagine the writers of the show, I think the actor who plays the father was one of the writers, and they must have had some kind of professional team consultation or something as they were writing that episode, because the psychologist does a decent job. There is a little glitch though that I caught, and again I don't. It's tiny, but I don't know if you recall. She brings him hot cocoa, and she reaches in her purse in the hallway and takes out. We call them marshmallows. They're called something else in the UK, I think.
No, we're marshmallows.
And she takes them out. Yeah. Okay. She takes them out. And puts them in the hot cocoa and brings it in to the kid. And he notices this. He says, "Oh, you remembered I like marshmallows." Well, that set it up, I think, because that gave him a sense of, maybe I can hook her. If she remembered to do that for me, maybe I can play her. And I don't know, again, like how they were thinking about that scene, but it's just an interesting kind of setup that I made me think a lot about. Like, gosh, I wonder if that was intentional, like that they specifically wanted her to go in and kind of then appear, because that's what a psychopathic child might feel. Or might think. Actually, they don't tend to feel much more other than power, which you saw in that episode a lot. When he felt threatened, that's when he had to exert his power. So anyways, I'll let you kind of have the floor here.
No, it's good. It's good. What came to my mind, obviously, when the show was released, there was a lot of talk about the conversation. We're opening up the conversation to talk about these ideas, and how do parents have the conversation with their children about this stuff. And when I was rereading your book, the section that I found particularly interesting was this sort of part on communication and language with adolescents. And you sort of start with discussing how language for adolescence becomes limited sort of naturally in some sense, sort of one word answers to, authority figures like your parents and things like that. But particularly, you have a part of the book where you talk about how many of these isolated young men start to internalize themselves as kind of monsters, and monsters kind of symbolize, symbolic of alienation. And there's this line you talking about the destructive part of a few of your clients had this internal perception of themselves as monsters, and it produced an internal chaos, cutting them off from relating to the sort of wider world. And I wonder if this is a part of it. They kind of, the alienation causes these young men to start seeing themselves as these monsters, and obviously you talk about different ways that manifests a lot with the body and body image, but at some point these symbolic figures, a lot of them see themselves as, I think one's perhaps a goblin or a gargoyle, and zombies and things like that. Those are all monsters that attack people. That they are sort of difficult to look at. They are kind of alienated away from the normal society, but there is an element of them all that does attack people. And I wonder if that's if that barrier to be able to communicate their inner world to the world around them is something that is then manifesting these young men. And I was hoping you could expand a little bit more on this idea of men being at a loss for words, I guess. Young men being at a loss for words.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's a nice way that you conceptualized your question there, because alienation, like Apocolpse, is twofold. And I think there's what we think of as, so-and-so is alienated from their mother. And so that there's a fracture or a rupture in a relationship, and that the people can't bridge it. So that's a kind of colloquial way that we might understand alienation. It's a fascinating word because I think it comes from the French, and in French it meant aliéné could mean somebody who was very disturbed, and so psychiatrists in the late 19th, early 20th century were often called alienists. And that was because they worked with these people who are alienated. The second meaning that I think is more relevant for the work I do is, which isn't to say that the external alienation isn't important, but the internal one, where a person feels like they have all these dark compartments inside that they can't open up. And that often is where this lost for words comes into play, because language is actually complicated. I was having this conversation, I think last week, with a colleague and about language, and some people think language is actually a behavior, and that it's different from thought. That, in other words, our thoughts are something that kind of take place in our minds, and that are always, sort of being processed, formulated, dissipating, coming together, all these different, going unconscious. But that it's a question of inner attention that you bring to your thoughts that then allows you to communicate and use language. So I like that. I think there's some dispute about whether or not, again, that's actually accurate. Some people might claim that that language is actually an expression of your thoughts, that it's the thoughts that somehow stimulate the language. But this other formulation, that it's a behavior and that it's actually coming from inner attention, that looks at the thoughts and then grabs onto something and then expresses it. I like that, because where a person feels blocked internally, they often can't describe things. And they often will say, so you see this clinically a lot, that people will say, I don't have the words for it, or I don't know what to say. There's a case in the book where I think it's, I don't know if it's in the chapter called Breaking It, and it's about these boys who have to break things. And there's a case about a boy who goes psychotic after a sexual experience that ends up in the girl getting pregnant. young woman, actually. She was older than him. And when he came to me, his parents brought him in and said he's mute. He won't talk, and they were quite upset, obviously. And I sat with him, and I tried to ask him a few questions, and I was trying to think what's going on with this fellow, and he would often just say, "I can't say," and I think he meant that literally. I think he meant he couldn't look inside anymore and find something that then he could communicate, that he could use language for. And so this loss of words, I think, is something that where there is this internal alienation is quite pronounced, and you do see it quite frequently with teenage boys and young men. There is I think I reference it in the book, even a funny terminology for this called NMA, meaning normative male alexithymia. And alexithymia is an inability or a difficulty to express an emotion or a feeling. And so this would be a descriptive term for what you and I are talking about here, that when people are at a loss for words, boys or young men, that there's this way in which it appears, it shows up. I've had encounters with parents where, when I'm seeing a teenage boy, I meet with the parents. There's usually an age cutoff where I kind of don't do that so much, but let's say it's a 14-year-old boy, and there I would meet on occasion with his parents, and they'll often say he doesn't say anything and we can't get him to talk, and I'll listen and sympathize with them, and then I'll often say, is there any place where you've had more conversation with your son? And often it's in the car. I'll hear in the car. And I'll say, go for more drives. That if that's where he's talking, go for more drives. And they'll laugh. But it's frequently works. I don't want to say it's a silver bullet or anything, but it's frequently like that they want to talk. They just feel blocked, and it's this inner blockage, I think, that is so painful in a way, that you have to think about, well, what would help, what would enable that, what would support at least trying to reach inside.
Why do you think that might be with the cars? Do you think it's because it's in some sense, I mean, is it like a liminal space? Is it, because I think there's something you talk about in the book, which I really wanted to talk about, but I was worried we'd go down the rabbit hole, but we're here now, so I'm going to say it. But it was talking about the cutting, for instance, and a lot of the language we use around phrases is to do with like cutting. It's very much about sort of, I guess, bringing wider things into sort of smaller, we cut to the chase, or etc., etc. Pierce through the noise. I don't know, I can't remember the ones you use, but I'm going off the top of my head. It's all about this taking wider stuff into something more manageable. And I won't say exactly what I do for my work, but I work with, my work has brought me into contact in a professional capacity with people in crisis who are often self-harming, and that is such a common thing that when I ask them, what does the cutting do for you? What purpose does it serve that you know of? And they will say, well, everything that I'm feeling in my head, I can't grasp that. I can't make that anything. It's overwhelming. But when I pierce that skin, there it is. There's everything that I'm experiencing there in the cut coming out in whatever it may be. It becomes somatic, I guess, physical and felt. I've gone off on the tangent there because I guess something was compelling me to say it.
No.
But in terms of that, being able to then, I guess, articulate their inner world and to be able to speak in the car. What would you, I guess, think it is about that space that perhaps does it in that instance?
Well, I don't know exactly what it is about the car, other than that you're not sitting necessarily face to face. I think this is true too. Like the other place I've heard parents say that like when they're walking on the beach or going on a hike, then the son will be able. So there's something about not being face to face and having the demand. I think it's almost like that face-to-face contact creates an expectation, and there's some sort of anxiety or pressure to perform, and I think that that can short circuit anybody. But I think for some of these boys in particular, that whole idea of having to perform and being on the spot, talking about feelings is a big issue for boys, and obviously that's a huge part of that series, Adolescence, too. But I think there's something about that I've been thinking about this a lot in the last couple of years, because it just seems like there's something about heroism that won't go away, and I think it's because it's archetypal. It's just there deep in the psyche, and it shows up for girls too. So I don't want to dichotomize here, but the way in which it shows up for boys is often this heroic code, which is stoicism is a part of it. Strength, stoicism, no tolerance for shame, and loyalty to your comrades or friends. And so it's just remarkable how this appears. And obviously we all enjoy heroism. We enjoy stories about heroes. Superheroes are a big thing in the media, but I think like, despite all the educational advances of the last 20 or 30 years that people have made trying to change curriculums and make them more egalitarian in terms of gender issues, this heroism is there. And that goes back to what your question about the problem at the beginning with initiation, because if the hero is not initiated, I mean, this is going back into kind of Jungian thinking, but also an analyst here in San Francisco, Joseph Henderson, who wrote a book called Thresholds of Initiation, that if the hero is not initiated, there are risks then that the hero will flip. And there's almost like that's where this monstrousness and freakishness and demonic trickster figure come in. And if that gains the upper hand in a young person's psyche, they're at high risk for doing something destructive. It could be self-destructive, it could be physically destructive, it could be emotionally destructive. But that's where that there's a tip. And often those things occur around incidents of a humiliation or something that's felt particularly shaming.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's somewhat, I wouldn't say worrying, but yeah, I think to think that we are perhaps missing that kind of initiation in the culture worries me, in the sense that you're dealing with large numbers of young men who are then going out into the world perhaps vulnerable to that kind of switch. And maybe it's a case of sort of, not having distress tolerance built up enough, and the appropriate sort of modelling of that, how to handle distress. Because a lot of those initiations in various different cultures were quite intense and were quite like, taking young boys away from their mothers in the middle of the night and send them out into the forest to survive for themselves. And that's probably a conversation for another day about extremes of our initiations, if we are to find new ones and new myths for young men to kind of orientate themselves to, what degree of suffering do we put young boys through in Western culture, when it is, like we talked about, limbic capitalism, it is so full of comforts. How do you navigate that? I want to pivot because I'm aware that we're somewhat limited for time, and I really want to talk about your paper on gender and identity, just in the last sort of the last piece of this episode. Am I correct in saying? See, I get me quotes, but I don't get every single piece of research right. This won an award, is that right?
It did, yeah. There's it was in the Journal of Analytical Psychology, which is really the primary international Jungian journal for clinical work, and has been for decades. So I think it's been around for over 70 years. I think they're going to be celebrating their 75th in London sometime later this year.
Well, congratulations. It was an interesting read for me.
Thank you.
When I was reading this, it sort of confronted me with my own masculinity, I think. One, because I think it's gender identity in this sort of day and age, it's a very hot button issue, and everyone seems to have an opinion on it and the right answer on what should be done. But two, when it got to near the end of the paper, and there was this discussion of an interaction between you and one of your clients, and the sort of transference role you played, and the way this young lad kind of looked at your identity and the way you presented yourself as a compassionate human being, amongst other things, I felt a deep emotional welling up. I sort of felt tearful when I was reading it, and I thought it was interesting. In the process of reading, it's I think there was almost a tension of opposites. There is this element of myself that does maybe look at some of these. I don't really like to involve myself in the cultural war stuff, because I don't know enough about these topics to comment on it too deeply. But there are probably things that maybe I go, well, I'm not sure about that, and someone might say, well, you're wrong. But then there's also this other parts of me as a human being that reads your paper and goes, this is important. These are people that, when they feel seen, when they feel sort of witnessed, and they are helped to kind of see that they can have these kind of less rigid gender identities, the difference that can make, not just on a inner level for them, on an interpersonal level within their families, and then outwardly into their lives. I know I've gone on a bit of a tangent there. Can you just tell us a little bit about this paper? Obviously, it's about how you think these expansive identities are kind of, this conversation around it is coming up in the kind of cultural unconscious. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. Well, again, thank you for reading the paper, and that's moving that you felt strongly there reading about the patient's experience, because to me, when I write, I try and convey something about what the clinical work is like, and I'm hoping it lands for people. I don't, of course, know, and so I appreciate what you said. This is such a complicated topic, and it's almost like a fireball, and we're playing catch with it. We're throwing this fireball around, and I gave the paper at a conference in Essex the week that the Cass report came out, Hilary Cass's report. And so it was, I remember reading at breakfast, I think I was reading The Guardian, and I was supposed to give my talk like in an hour. I was like, oh my God, what am I stepping into? And But I also thought and felt, what am I stepping into? Yes, do it. And there's a sense in which if we don't talk about gender, which is very complicated, that I think we're going to sweep aside something that causes a lot of pain and suffering for boys and young men. And I think that, again, it goes back to something about this archetypal heroism. If that's the way you're thinking you're going to initiate yourself in the 21st century, you're probably going to be in for trouble. There has to be some way to expand the paradigm and to incorporate other dimensions of masculinities that are not like straitjackets and that are not corrective about you can't be like a woman, or you can't be like a gay person, or whatever the message is about not being some other way that you might feel you are. I think we're all bits and pieces of things. I use this idea of a mosaic because I think it captures a lot more about what the fragmentation of the human mind and psyche in the 21st century. And there's nothing bad with a mosaic. Mosaics can be quite beautiful, but their beauty is in all the pieces. And being able, if you look at just one piece in a mosaic, you don't really see a whole lot. You have to step aside and try and appreciate the fullness of what it is. And so I think it's a little bit that way with gender, that there are these ways in which, gender is become incredibly polarizing. There are people who feel that even talking about gender somehow transgresses, that this is something that should be left within the family realm, that this should not be part of anything in schools or colleges. And of course, that's ridiculous. I mean, Shakespeare wrote about gender. I mean, like that's hundreds of years ago. And the myths, lots of the myths are about gender roles changing and shifting. There's a myth about a man, Tiresias, who becomes a famous seer, and many of the other subsequent myths, and he changes gender. He lives as a woman for 7 years. So this has always been something that's been complicated and fascinating, but frightening. I want to say something too about gender, because there's a big debate now, and in a lot of research, the idea now is that gender is socially constructed, that we assume a gender role, that we perform it, that in other words, gender is performative, by and large based on how we're socialized. And that has to do with the schools we attend, the families we grow up in, the religions we practice, the traditions, the cultural traditions that our family espouses, a whole array of social things. And I think that is by and large true, but there is something else about gender, and that is there is a contribution based on our biology, on our bodies, and that those hormones take effect in utero, and they, we come out a certain way based to an extent on what that uterine environment was like and what those hormones, the way they were affecting the growth of the fetus. And so then there's a period, right, where then socialization does seemingly take over, but then there's puberty, and those hormones come in again. And these are biological experiences. And I think we have to make space and room for that. Just saying that it's socially constructed, and I've made this mistake, I want to own it, but saying that it's just socially, you overlook then that there are these important biological factors that say something about our bodies and our relationship with our bodies. And so I think part of the complexity now is that you can see, if you could see that it were both these things, if you make space for both these things, that maybe some of the polarization in the public discourse might dissipate, because it seems like that's what's happened a lot, is that the talk about gender has put people in a camp of, no, it's socially constructed, it's all taught, it's all about what we learn. And then people who are saying, wait, that can't be true, that goes against common sense. We have our biology, we're born a certain way. Why are you and so these two camps are now kind of duking it out. And what I'm trying to say here is, look, the mosaic means there's both of them have something to contribute. So I hope that makes some sense of what is a really complicated subject.
It does, and I guess we're limited for time, and I would have loved for you to talk about it more, but I will encourage everyone. Is the paper public currently? Is it? It's in the journal.
I think people can access it and download it on the Journal of Analytical Psychology website. I shared the prize this year with. It's called the Fordham Prize, the Michael Fordham Prize. He was a British Jungian psychoanalyst who really looked at children and adolescents and developed a model that really he extended Jung's work. In other words, he took Jung's work and extended it into childhood and adolescence and made an amazing contribution. So the award is named in his honor, and I think every year when there is an award-winning paper or papers, the person I shared it with is Jay Barlow, who is an analyst in London, and his paper was called The Umbilical, which is a really rich gem of a paper about his work with somebody who is transgender, a young adult man who is transgendered. And so they usually make these papers available for download because they're in a different kind of category for a while.
I will put the names and hopefully
I have time
links.
for one more question. So if you wanna, I know you had a list, and so we had a little bit of a. Yeah.
All right, I appreciate that. Okay, so what I will say is I'll put the links to the papers in the description of the YouTube video and the audio files. Yeah, I mean, one thing I just want to say before I do ask this final question is I think, we kind of talked about that YouTube algorithm, how it will quickly take you from one thing to something more extreme very quickly. And I think that happens in these political, ideological discussions, that if you kind of orientate yourself in the world, I say this from direct experience and why I stepped back from it, you will find yourself pushing away ideas, pushing away voices that you may not even remotely disagree with, just because you get a sense that it doesn't align with your camp or your side of things. And I think it's a shame. It alienates us more. It closes us off to each other. And I think in reading your paper, like I said, I'm certainly not. I'm all for everything you were talking about, and I think it's fantastic. But I think, I'm reasonably sort of traditionally masculine. I feel I have a good connection with my inner femininity, but I don't sort of outwardly express it. I like shirts with big collars and fashion and things like that, but not for all intents purposes, sort of traditionally masculine in my appearance, but I will find that I may have views on some of these. Trans people in sports, perhaps, if I just put it out there, maybe there's a discussion, a nuanced discussion that needs to happen there, right? But say you had that opinion that that shouldn't happen, you would maybe shut yourself off to every possible idea that varied gender identities, kind of fluid gender identities can exist. And it not only closes you off to other people, I think it closes you off to yourself. And your inner world can surprise you as much as anything, can more so than anything, arguably. And I think that's, for me, is the shame, is that people will perhaps not get to experience the becoming of who they are, in the fact that they maybe are just a bit captivated with the narratives. So I'll move to a question now. I've sort of fumbled my way through that point. You can almost feel the complex around the gender stuff and the nervousness you were talking about, sort of in my speech when I'm talking about it. So, I specifically spoke about your interaction and how the transference, acting like a kind of role model figure, supportive, and how that interplay between you and the client played out. How might clinicians who sort of have not examined their own gender ideological presuppositions in sort of particular detail, how might they work on sort of looking at that? What are ways that you think they can improve those interactions, whether it be a psychologist, whether it be a mental health nurse, whether it be, just a person on the street sort of trying to support someone who needs help? What are sort of ways that you think people can maybe sort of look inward at challenging some of these gender ideological presuppositions they might have and maybe not know?
That's a big question, Chris. I'll do my best in a couple of minutes. The thing that I also was going to mention. So I talked about this polarization between the biological and the social construction. The contribution that Jungians can make is the archetypal dimension. That there is something like, that's what I meant with earlier when I was talking about this archetypal heroism. It comes back, it's in there, and that's from the collective unconscious. And so I think that's another contributing factor, and Jungians in particular, I think are making a bit of an effort to really talk about this, that it's not just that the gender topic is either biological or social construction, but there's something about the archetypal dimension too, helping people like open up about their gender things. I often find it's really interesting to ask people just a simple question, if it's a male, what did you learn from your father? And just go from there. Just see where it happens. You might get somebody who says nothing, and then be interesting to say, oh, that what was that like for you to not learn anything from your father, and that who did you turn to then? And so there are lots of ways to expand that conversation. This is not to say that fathers are like somehow the crucial element here, but they are a significant element. Maybe they are a crucial element actually, and how a male comes to understand their masculinity. And so that relationship with the father, I think, is in the mix, and is something that is accessible conversationally with most people. And so that often I find is just an interesting entry point to try and get people to talk about gender, because they often won't remember something that happened to them when they were much younger, and you can sort of like ask them how they felt about that memory, that sort of thing.
Yeah, bring it away from the kind of collective noise and kind of, yeah, bring it to the personal, the kind of relatable.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That's good advice. I'm gonna remember and I'm gonna reflect myself. Dr. Tyminski, thank you so much for your time. I wish we could have spoken more, and maybe one day I can have you back on the show to speak a little bit more. Where can people find you currently?
So I have a website. It's www.roberttyminski.com. There's no hyphen or dot in the middle part. So that's a good place. And then I am on LinkedIn, also as Robert Tyminski. And I think on my publisher's website, Routledge, they probably have an author page, and I would be listed there. It's Routledge is ROUTLEDGE.com. So
I'll include this stuff again in the sort of show notes and things like that. But yeah, thank you again. I will just say that this book was actually, it's quite a pivotal book for me. One of those ones that you see and you think, I'm gonna find that interesting, and then I read and it did not disappoint. I often will talk about it, tell people about it. And having a second read before this was, again, I sort of spot things that I didn't see before. I urge everyone to check it out.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And yeah, everyone check out the paper on
Thank you so much.
Agenda. Thanks, Dr. Tyminski.
Yeah. I just wanted to say you're a wonderful interviewer, and I really appreciate that. So thank you to you for being so attentive and such a good reader.
That means a lot. Thank you very much.